And to me personally, this is one of the most beautiful parables for me personally. But I'm going to talk about this parable with the insights of one of the books from Jonah John Angelis that is focusing primarily on the two. There's three important aspects in this parable, which is the father, and also there is the lost son, the prodigal son, and there's also the son who stayed behind with the father. So we're going to focus on those three components, and we're going to look at them in a philosophical way, but also focusing on a spiritual way of looking at the parable within the sights and the insights of Spiritism. So I'm just going to go through the parable quickly. I'm going to ask, if you don't mind, so it's in English at the top and Portuguese at the bottom. Can we just go around and ask everybody to help? Can you start just reading the English piece? Yeah, over there.
Yeah. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them."
Thank you. Oh,
Yeah, if you can go.
sorry. Please. Yeah.
Not long after that, the younger
Son.
got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth and wild living.
Thank you. Please.
After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need.
Thank you.
I can read it distant, but not far. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything.
Thank you. Did you read, John? Sorry.
So when he came to his senses, he
Yeah.
said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants."
Thank you so much. Can you?
Yes. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him.
Thank you. Chris?
The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son."
Thank you.
But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again.
Thank you.
He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, the oldest son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on.
Thank you.
"Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him.
Thank you.
But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you, and never disobeyed you or your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat, so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him."
Thank you. John.
My son, the father said, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and he is alive again. He was lost and now he's found.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I think what you can tell is that there is several elements in this story. And the way that, if you think about the way that Jesus, whenever he came into our world, he incarnated in a time where people had a different way of seeing things. We were much more simple people back then. So what he used elements of everyday's lives to be able to make sense of a story, to be able to convey a message to all of us. And in this parable, there are several elements he goes to, he talks about. So there's first is this the father, the center of the piece, the father in the land meaning, being a farmer, and that was the way to show wealth and prosperity at the time. He had 2 sons. There's no wife in this parable. The focus is on the father itself. There's 2 sons, and the prodigal son comes to the father, but if you think about it, he comes to the father, but the father is still alive. So he's asking for a piece of his inheritance. So what does that mean? He's asking for a piece of inheritance from someone who is still alive, meaning that normally when you go through inheritance, that's a sign that the person who would give you the inheritance, chances are this person has already passed away. But it shows to us a sign of rebelliousness there from that child, because he's actually asking his father, who is still alive, to give him a piece of his fortune or his money. Yeah?
Was it the same at that time?
Hmm?
Was it the same at that time?
Yes. There is a few books. There is this book from Joanna de Angelis, which we'll go through later on, and she also explains this in detail, meaning that it was a sign, he was actually showing to us a sign of rebelliousness within the story, because it was using pieces back in the days of different elements, and it shows that the other child stayed behind to help his father. But really interesting what you just said, because the child who stayed behind, it shows in the story that when the other son, the prodigal son, comes back home, comes back to his father, he actually felt quite annoyed because he never had even a calf to be killed to be able to celebrate with his friends for a party. And his father actually killed a big animal to be able to celebrate the fact that his prodigal son came back home. So there's several pieces in this story. One interesting piece that we need to think about as well is the ring. So the ring that the father is giving to the child when he comes back home, meaning a sign of unity. And also the clothing that they gave to him as a sign of welcoming him back into the family. Because when he first came back, he was expecting to work as a servant because of the way that he was so ungrateful to his father, on the way he said goodbye to his father. But what happened was that his father was the one who actually leaned to him and gave him clothing and gave him a ring, meaning that he would welcome him back in the same level as he was before he left. So it's very interesting, because when we think about Jesus' parables, they always have like a lot of meaning behind them, a lot of different elements, a lot of different pieces for us to be able to explore. And like I said, there's 3 elements there, the 3 main elements in this piece of the parable. And the first piece that we look at, that we can analyze, is the father. So what would the father mean in a psychological standpoint? If you think about psychology, but also looking at the spiritual side of the meaning of the father within this parable itself, we could consider him to be the center of self-consciousness, meaning that our self, our higher self, so whatever we have that we're aiming to develop as individuals, like our main qualities, our main everything that we're looking to develop within ourselves, meaning that us as immortal beings, when we come back to this planet, this is what we're looking to do. We're trying to work on our inner self to become better beings. And some examples that Joanna de Angelis brings to us when she talks about this parable in one of her books is about us being the self, our divine essence, because we're immortal beings. And at the same time, we're aiming to develop all of these virtues here that we could attribute, like love, like honesty. We could also think about resilience, all the good qualities that we're all aiming to produce within ourselves and explore and further develop. Also, we could think about fraternity, solidarity, ethics. Ethics meaning to be honest, to be faithful to ourselves, and then to other people in relation to others. Also, tolerance, patience, sincerity. These are just some examples of things that we aim to develop within a certain period of our lives. And it's pretty much impossible to develop all of that in one single incarnation. But the meaning of the Father within that parable is to show our divine essence. So what we're looking to develop and how passionate He is, how kind and embracing He is towards both kids. I wouldn't call them kids. I mean, they were meant to be adults, or maybe like late adolescents back in the parable, because of the times of the days. If you think about how long people used to live, how long people used to take until they got married. So we could think about all of these elements when we're looking at the figure of the Father. What is the other element in the parable that we have? We have the prodigal son. So the prodigal son is the one who came to the father, asked for his share. He went back and spent the money with his friends or in partying, etc. He then realized, oh, I've made a terrible mistake. I'm eating with the pigs, so why are the pigs referred in such a bad manner? So if you think about the Jewish tradition and also the way that people relate to the pigs traditionally, there's also the element that the pigs, they don't shed, they don't, because of the way their skin works, they don't sweat. And because they don't sweat, they're also considered to be very dirty animals, because they're not able to sweat, and also because they eat whatever is available to them on the floor. So those are the key elements, and meaning that their fat is also full of toxins. That's another reason why a lot of traditions don't believe that eating pig's meat is good for your health. Yeah, and he was actually eating with the pigs. If you remember, like he had to go and eat with the pigs, and then he realized actually his father's servants were eating much better food than he was, and that's when he realized, I should go back and ask for forgiveness from my father, and I'm gonna go and work for him. So if we think about from a psychological standpoint, there's a few books from Joanna de Angelis from her series. Self-Discovery, for example, it's a very good book that talks about a lot of these key elements and the elements of the self that actually stop us from looking at our true essence. She talks a lot about the variances. She calls it the variances of the self. And then the way that we could think is that our self is within us, but around us we have all this negativity or the negatives behind the negative of the ego, we could call it this way. So everything negative that we carry within ourselves that might be stopping us from being truly essence, truly reflective of our divine essence. And some of the examples that are given to us are impatience, which is the opposite from patience. We could also think about selfishness, which is the opposite from charity, from being charitable as well. We could also think about hate, being the opposite of love. And remember that we all have this in some extent within ourselves, right? So we're trying to get familiarized with the variances of the ego, but at the same time recognize them to be able to learn and grow. So if you think about the prodigal son, he was behaving in a very selfish way, but then he realized and he understood that he wasn't behaving the best way possible, and by being honest to himself, he was able to get closer to his divine essence. Yeah, and also here we have, for example, violence. We also have resentment, desperation. Can you think of any other variances of the self that might relate to you? Any ideas? Loads. Any examples? One?
You said so many already. I think I can fit in one or two.
Well, we all have them in some extent. Maybe some of us might be working hard in one of them, but we don't acknowledge that we have others. Or maybe we could be working harder into one of them in relation to something specific, but not in relation to something else. So the beauty about transpersonal psychology is that it gives us an opportunity to look at ourselves as an immortal being, and also the fact that although we're immortal beings, we're here to grow and to learn, and we know that we do have a certain time within this existence, and we should make the most of it. But at the same time, we shouldn't feel pressured into doing everything at the same time, because we have several incarnations. So we already had innumerous incarnations before, and we'll still have innumerous incarnations afterwards. But the beauty of this is to realize that there's a lot of work to be done, but let's start from the beginning. Let's start from where we are. And the interesting thing that Spiritism also tells us is that there's no competition. So Marcia, for example, she's a very evolved being in comparison to me. And it's okay, that's because she's already made that progress herself. She's already made lots of adjustments. She's already been connected to her dark side. Shadows, yeah. I was using a Star Wars quote. You're right, your shadows. So by the fact that you're connecting with your shadows or dark side, you're already in a much more advanced position than you were before, which is the third stage that we're going to look at. Sorry. Yes. Thank you. So we also have the older son. So the older son in this parable, if you can think about it, he was there right next to the father, and he was working in the fields, and he was doing everything he could to help and support the father. Now, the question that we might want to ask ourselves is, what was the intention behind it? Because yes, his brother did take a share of the estate that his father had. But you could clearly see from the parable that the father mentions that he gave a share to the older son as well. So he did give a share to the younger child, but also to the older son. So he was being equal. He was being kind, and he was sharing everything with both children, okay? Yeah. So he was being fair, he was being just, he was being kind, like God pretty much treats us, right? He was, of course, aware that the son decided to stay behind. Now the question that we might ask ourselves is, what was his intention on staying behind? Because he did complain to the father afterwards, why have you never given me a calf, or you've never given me a ring, or you've never given me a vest, which were symbols at the time of the fact that you were welcoming someone into the house. So if you think about farming back into the way that it was done in the old days, if you were to kill an animal was quite dear, it was quite considered to be quite a treasure for the family to have an animal. Not so long ago, actually, if you think about the last 150 years, 200 years as well. So the fact that he asked the people working for him, his servants, to kill an animal, to have a feast for everyone in the farm. He didn't just have a feast for himself and for the children. He had a feast for everyone in the farm as a sign of welcoming him back into the family. That shows it was a very, very important decision that he made, a very powerful decision, which was to kill the animal. If you think about the representation behind the animal. And the older son stayed there, but he wasn't very happy because he's never been given an animal, not even a calf. Calf means a smaller considered to be a smaller scale animal back then. Yeah. So what was the intention behind of that older son? So
Duty.
Hmm?
He was doing his duty.
he was doing his duty.
for his
Yeah.
father. The one thing I've not got here,
Yeah.
as a child I was taught this parable at school. I didn't realise that the father, when he gave the prodigal son, I've missed it obviously somewhere along, that he gave the other son an equal share at the same time.
That's when
Does
he.
it say that?
So the
Because I don't
father.
remember that.
So when the older son questions him about the reasons why he never gave him a calf,
No.
the father mentions on the parable that he gave him a fair share, and he's always been there with him, next to him. So meaning that you've always been here, you've always had access to everything that I have. I've given you everything that I have,
Because he never left.
because he never left. Exactly.
But what I was
Yeah.
my interpretation of what you said was that when the prodigal son went off,
Yeah.
at the same time, simultaneously, he gave the older son his share as
Correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't remember that either.
I
I
don't
don't
think
remember that.
that's what
Because
you
he
mean, Carol?
pleased.
I understand as he was mentioning that he always had his share because he never
It was
left.
there.
So he wasn't given, as I understand at least, in a way that this is your part and this is your part, but like you are here,
He had everything.
not taking advantage, but enjoying or with me of whatever we have. So I don't understand as it was given equally separated. Is that what you mean?
I think there's different interpretations because the books, the parable itself, it does say like when the father goes back to the older son, he does say that he's giving him a share. So, like you said, it is open to interpretation. The interpretation that I understood was that he gave a share to the older son as well, and also in addition to that, he was there having the feast. He was being treated with special. In a special way because he was the son of the father who was the owner of the land, and he does question the child, meaning that you are here, you are eating with me, you're having you're having everything that I have,
Yeah.
you're having your share and my share, you're having everything, whereas your son, he was lost and now he is alive.
I understand that.
Yeah.
But it's just that deliberate bit where he turns
Yeah.
and says, I'll give you both a share.
Yeah.
He didn't do that. He basically assumes that the older boy, as he says to him at the end of the parable, that all this is yours. This is your share. But at the start, he didn't say that's his share. That's the bit
Can I
Yeah.
say what I think? It's like I am a dad and I have two children. One wants to travel, and I give some money because he doesn't have money to travel. I think it's the same way. Like you help out for him to go and do what he wants to do. I think because the other didn't go anywhere, he didn't really need to get that share and give to his hand because he was there already.
That's where it was assumed that
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
his.
There is actually different interpretations of this parable, but I think these are all great points. Great points.
The first thing that came to my mind that the doctor you treat who is sick, like the prodigal son, and this is why he need more attention because he's repentance. But associate with the workers of the last hour as well, because the workers that was there long time received the same as the one that worked just 1 hour, and this caused wow. But he promised 1 denarius in that time for everybody. He was very generous.
That's a great
See?
parable to
Yeah,
explore as
yeah.
well, because there is a very interesting twist on that one, yeah. But it's really interesting because the older son, now in my question, like you said, who needed more help? Was it the prodigal son or the older son?
The
Now-
older son was doing no trouble. It was okay. in the right
Well,
That's
that's the twist. That's the twist, because the thing is, the older son, he was there, but he was there taking advantage, and then once he had the trigger, which was when the prodigal son came back, he then had a trigger. He showed his true colors. So that's when he showed you know, what he was about. And from a psychological standpoint, we could see him as being the masks of the ego. So we call them the masks of the ego. So those are the masks that we use to protect ourselves from ourselves. So if I don't want to show that I envy you, I might use a mask, different masks, to pretend that I'm okay or that I'm better, or you know, or maybe like, you know, when we see people, when you see them and you feel that they're much more, they're better than you, you might decide to then start to gossiping about them, or you know, to look at the negatives of that person, meaning that you focus on the outside but forget to focus on the inside. In Joanna De Angelis, she talks a lot about the fact that we use the masks of the ego all the time. So the oldest son, in that case, he was using the mask of the ego. He was there, he was very quiet, very sincere, you know, in his ways. But later he showed his true colors, meaning his masks, the masks of the ego. And what kind of masks could it be that we're using in our day-to-day lives? Any ideas?
Selfishness.
Selfishness could be, yeah.
Self-righteous.
Self?
Righteous.
Yeah. Any other ideas?
Many masks really, right? Because if you are at work, you behave that way. If you are with mom, the masks are all gone. Yeah.
At home, at least, you show more yourself.
Yeah.
But there is one that is trying to take advantage of situations and people.
Mm-hmm.
So a mask that I think that in different situations we all might use.
Mm-hmm.
In this case we're talking about, I understand that he was happy somehow that the younger brother went away, because then he would get all the inheritance for himself.
Mm-hmm.
Like
everything that was left.
everything else
Plus,
would,
yeah.
So I think that could be us in a way. You
Mm-hmm.
know.
It could be. So you see, it's really interesting because the parables, Jesus' parables, they have different elements, and we can learn a lot about ourselves when we look at them from a different way, isn't it? So some of the things that she points out to us is projection. So when project on other people. So instead of focusing on a negative point that I have on myself, I look at the other person, and the other person has that, and I focus on that, because it's easy for me to focus on the other person instead of focusing on me. One other mask that she uses is Puritanism. So for example, like I said, I used to drink a lot of alcohol, and then now I'm judging everybody who drinks alcohol. So, and a lot of people do that. And smoking, you could think about smoking, you could think about any other addictions, sugar, you know, all the, you name it, gossiping. Can you think of anything else?
There's one funny one where the comedian does, if you see somebody parking in a invalid's bay, that he says you find yourself looking to make sure they're an invalid. And it's true, you know. Sometimes you and it's a subtle thing, but it's, you know, the guy has got to come out with a wheelchair or something because he shouldn't be parked there otherwise. I always thought that was very funny.
Then because of the invisible disability, you don't know, even if the person, for example, has epilepsy or diabetes or mental issues, and entitled to a disabled body. So it's
I agree with the comedian's making the point that you know, human nature. You guys got to come up with something, you know, otherwise you're not satisfied.
And that's a very interesting mask, isn't it? Because because probably I have done this before, and then I focus on the other person because, oh, you know, he's doing it now, so let's watch him. So that's a good example. I think we're going to stop for now. Yeah, okay. We're going to continue looking into, because this slide here, in my eyes, this is the biggest lesson that we have from this parable, is to focus on the masks. And we're going to be exploring that more next week. Thank you.
Thank you.